contacts are weighted equally, and they're not. So if you were to use this, you need to figure out what do the size of your circles look like, because they're going to be different. And you're probably going to need to get a few people to sanity check you on that so that you're actually weighing them correctly. And lastly, I do think that this works well for trade-off or pivot decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, the difference between the two is, I think in a trade-off decision, you're typically dealing with the same set of users. In a pivot decision, you're probably looking at two different sets of users. Any questions on Framework 2 before we jump to the top 10? Okay, top 10. So this is my top 10 list of things that I've learned from doing all the user interviews of what works well, what doesn't work well, and sometimes almost like as a checklist for me. So for number one, a real intimacy is one-on-one. When you do an interview, you want to be you and the other person. You don't want to interview multiple people because then they're going to have a competition of who says the best thing or speaking over the other person. And you don't want to intimidate the person that you're interviewing with having somebody else beside you. Right? So one-on-one is real intimacy. Number two, call me maybe. I know a lot of people think that in-person is the best way to do interviews, but I actually have found phone to be extremely helpful for a couple reasons. One, you can scale faster. You can reach your ideal person because they're not located where you are. And it's easier to coordinate and schedule so you're moving faster. Number two, people sometimes are more willing to share certain things when they can hide behind a phone than when they're in person. And it's easier for you to take notes. Nomo why? I learned this a little bit from experimentation and also from reading a book by a guy who did counterintelligence at the FBI for about 30 years. And that why questions make the person feel defensive. So how, what, tell me more, help me understand is a much more neutral question that you can ask a user. Notes, notes, and notes. Look, you can't remember everything. You will need to refer back to your notes later when you're dealing with a trade-off decision. Or when you're putting slides together for an internal or external presentation, you're going to want to pull some quotes from some users to illustrate some things. So having extremely detailed notes will benefit you in the long run. Number five, be curious like a child. If you've ever done user interviews when you knew the space versus when you didn't know the space, you probably understand the challenge that you can have when you bring those preconceived notions into those interviews and the biases that that can create. And you have to figure out how to go back in time and actually embrace your inner 3 or 4-year-old to be so curious, so just full of awe, so neutral and willing to explore anything and everything. And that's where I think you'll be able to pull some things out of users that you normally wouldn't. Number 6 is one of my favorite, and that is simply silence. When you figure out when is the appropriate time in an interview to just be silent and let the other person talk, they get nervous and they just want to fill the air, or they feel like they need to talk. And either they're going to tell you something that you didn't think you could ask, that you didn't think that they would ever tell you, or that you didn't think to ask. And look, you can't do this all the time. You can't start out with it, but there are times where you can just be silent and just wait and see what happens. And the risk is extremely low. But it's a little bit of the game of whoever talks first sort of loses, in a sense. 7 is don't lead a horse to water. So I believe in actually writing out all of your questions in advance and looking at them and having some other people look at them to figure out, like, where are your leading questions and how can you avoid that. 8 is 50-50 cohorts. So when you do iterative interviews, I like to have, from my first group to my second group, I like to have some of the people in that second group from the first group and some to be brand new. And then you keep on doing that. When you get to your 5th round of it, you have people from the very beginning, so you have this continuity and you can build with them. But what you also do is you allow yourself to hedge against that person who created, from the first one, emotional ownership. And so now they actually want you to succeed, and they're not being as candid as they normally would, and you're also not getting that kind of first-time user experience. So when you can compare that against the people who are brand new, you can tease out the difference between the two and see if you're getting any flaws in your data. 9, dealing with trying to figure out what people are willing to pay or how to price something. I think whether you're trying to do anchoring of it's going to be $1 million, oh, what would you be willing to pay, or what do you think this is worth, or even conjoint analysis are extremely difficult, because I think most users are terrible at predicting the future of what they would do, especially when it involves them taking out their credit card. And I think you can really only look to what they're currently doing and what they've done in the past, what they've actually paid for, and weight that much higher than what they're telling you of what they would do in the future. And number 10, I created my own acronym called Finissimo, which is an acronym for functional, emotional, and social. And I believe that when doing these research and you're trying to understand a problem of your user very deeply, we typically start and stop with just the functional problem. But if you can understand the emotional problem and the social problem, you will understand the user at a problem at a much deeper level, which I think will allow you to make much better decisions going forward. So an example of that, there's somewhat of a famous example by Clayton Christensen where he talks about the milkshake at McDonald's. Right? So the milkshake, and this was milkshakes for breakfast. The milkshake, the functional problem was fill my belly and so that I feel full and I'm not hungry when 10 a.m. hits. Okay, so just give me food, keep me satiated. That's kind of functional problem. The emotional problem was make me feel like I'm being healthier than eating a bunch of donuts or a pastry. And the social problem was allow me to get to work and not have crumbs all over my clothing from driving in the car and trying to drive and eat at the same time so that I don't look like a slob. A similar one, another example of that is Tesla, right? So it's just a car. Functional problem, get me from point A to point B. The emotional is make me feel good about caring about the environment and being green. And the social aspect is give me something that's beautiful and makes me feel sexy when I'm driving it so that I can stand out amongst my peers and I can be more fashionable than them. And I think if you were to force yourself to ensure that you actually understand the functional, emotional, and social, you will find out that you actually understand your users much more deeply than you ever thought that you could. Thank you. I hope that some of this was helpful. I hope that you will take whatever mistakes and lessons that you learned from them over the years and share it with other folks in the community so that we can one day reach the penultimate of being able to anticipate and fulfill the needs and wants of all of our users. So, thank you.
Yes. Questions?
Yeah. Well, we got one in the back.
All right.
No, I thought we did.
Should we run a mic?
Another one?
Make them feel as silly as you felt in your mind.
It's okay. No? No questions?